Wyoming Territory, November 1880, the wind had teeth, and the cliffside was pure ice. Jonas Carver pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he guided his mare along the narrow trail above the canyon. Snow had started falling again. The storm had hit hard the night before, and now the terrain was slick, the air sharp enough to split skin. He had been riding since dawn, checking on his trap lines, when something caught his eye, a flash of pale blue against the gray rock far ahead. He slowed the mare. "Easy, girl," he murmured. There, huddled against a rock ledge near the edge of the cliff, was a woman. Her dress was torn at the hem, soaked and frozen to her legs. She was lying half-curled, arms wrapped tight around herself, her hair tangled and stiff with frost. She looked like she had been there all night. Jonas dismounted fast, boots crunching through snow. One wrong move and she would slide right off the ledge. He moved slow, crouching when he reached her side. "Miss," he said, voice low. "Can you hear me?" Her lips were blue, her eyes fluttered open barely. She was young, maybe 22. Her skin was pale, cheekbones sharp with cold and hunger. She rasped. "My name is Selah." Jonas slid an arm under her back and another beneath her knees. "You will freeze to death out here," he said. "I am getting you somewhere warm." Her head dropped against his chest, too weak to argue. He carried her back to the mare, hoisted her carefully onto the saddle, then climbed up behind her, steadying her body against his. She was trembling hard, her fingers curled like claws. His cabin sat a mile west, tucked in a stand of fir trees. It had only one room, but the roof held tight and the stove burned hot. He kept whispering to her the whole ride, her name, his name, promises she was safe now. By the time he pushed open the cabin door, her breathing was shallow. He set her down by the stove, stripped off her wet dress while keeping his eyes fixed anywhere but her skin, and wrapped her in dry quilts. Then he fed the stove with 3 logs and kept the fire roaring. She slept through the night and into the next day. When she woke, her voice was stronger. "Where am I?" "My cabin," Jonas said, pouring hot water into a tin cup and handing it to her. "We are about 5 miles from the town of Elk Hollow." Her hands shook as she took the cup. "I was trying to get there." Jonas sat on the edge of the chair across from her. "That why you were out on that cliff? What happened?" She looked down at the cup. "I was left behind." "By who?" "My fiancé," she said, then swallowed hard. "He got angry when I changed my mind. I told him I did not want to marry him. He left me outside of town. I walked for hours. Then it snowed." Jonas felt something tighten in his chest. She had risked death rather than marry a man she did not love. That was not weakness, it was courage. "You have people?" he asked. She shook her head. "My parents died last year. I was staying with a cousin in Cheyenne." "But she married and moved east." He nodded slowly. "You can stay here until you decide what you want to do next." Her eyes lifted to his. "Thank you, Mr. Jonas Carver. I am Selah Kincaid." He gave her a slight smile. "Good to meet you, Miss Kincaid." "Even if the circumstances are not ideal." Her lips curved, faint but real. In the days that followed, Selah regained her strength. She barely spoke of her past, and Jonas did not press. He kept the fire going, made her tea, gave her his bed while he slept on the floor. She helped with small chores once she could stand longer, washing tin plates, folding blankets, brushing the mare's coat. Jonas noticed the way her eyes lingered on the mountain beyond the window. She watched the white trees like they meant something. One evening after supper she asked, "Why are you out here alone?" "I came west after the war," he said. "Tried farming, failed, tried mining, nearly died. Trapping suits me, it is quiet." "You never married," he shook his head. "No woman willing to follow a man into the middle of nowhere." She smiled down at her hands. "Maybe you never met the right one." He looked at her then. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the softness of her mouth. She met his eyes and did not look away. The first snow melted and the days grew longer. Selah stayed. One morning while he was chopping wood, she came out to the porch in a shawl and boots far too big for her feet. He set the axe down. "I want to learn," she said. He taught her how to hold the axe, how to swing from the shoulder. She laughed when her first try barely nicked the log, and he laughed too. They ate biscuits and dried meat for lunch, sitting on the porch steps. "I thought I would die on that cliff," she said, voice quiet. "I remember thinking, this is it, this is where it ends." He turned to her. "But it did not." "No," she said, her eyes on his. "You came." Jonas swallowed thick. "You are the bravest person I have met, Selah." Her hand brushed his. She did not pull away. That night he built the fire higher than usual. She curled up on the cot, watching the flames. He sat nearby, sharpening a blade with slow, careful strokes. She said, "You saved my life." He looked at her. "I am glad I did." "I do not know what comes next," she whispered, "but I do not want to leave." The blade slipped from his hand. He picked it back up with a nod. "Then do not." She stood and crossed the room. "I mean it." He rose to meet her, heart pounding. "So do I." She reached up, touched his face. "You are the first man who ever made me feel safe." He closed the space between them, his lips brushing hers. She kissed him back like she had been waiting all her life, and in that kiss, Jonas knew he had found more than a woman to rescue. He had found his future. The weather shifted by mid-December, not warming but settling. The kind of cold that stayed, deep and still, pressing into bone and wood alike. Jonas had taken to waking early, lighting the stove before Selah stirred, then stepping out to check the snares and snow depth before the sun broke through the pines. One morning, while he was binding a torn bit of rawhide near the shed, he heard her humming. It was low and wandering, the kind of tune a person held close from childhood. He paused, not wanting to break it. When he came back inside, she was stitching the hem of a blanket, using thread unraveled from a worn shirt sleeve. Her hands moved steady, practiced. "You sew like you were raised to do it." "My mother taught me before I could spell my own name," she said. "She made me promise never to let my hands sit idle." He leaned against the doorframe. "She sounds like a woman who got things done." "She was," Selah said, looking toward the window. "She kept bees, said honey could heal most things if you were patient enough." Jonas let that settle. "You miss her." "Every hour," she replied, then folded the blanket across her lap. "I used to dream of her voice. Lately, I just dream of snow." He poured hot water into the tin basin and set it near her feet. "You never said what you hoped to find in Elk Hollow." "I had a letter," she said. "It was from a woman who needed help running her boarding house. I was going to answer it in person, ask if she still had the place open." "You still want that?" She looked up slowly. "I'm not sure. I wanted to earn my way, but now everything feels different." He crouched to check the firebox, feeding in a split log. "You don't owe anyone an explanation, Selah." "I owe myself one," she said. "I keep thinking maybe I was never meant to just survive." That night, she brought out the last of the dried apples he'd stored in a tin behind the stove. She stewed them with a pinch of salt and a bit of flour, and they ate in silence, the fire low and the shadows long. Afterward, she reached for her shawl and stepped outside without a word. Jonas followed a few minutes later. She was sitting on a log near the corral, watching the frost creep up the fence posts. "When I was a girl," she said, "I used to think if I could just get far enough west, I'd find someplace that felt like mine." He sat beside her, careful not to crowd. "And does this feel like it?" She turned her face toward him, breath clouding the air. "It feels like something I don't have to run from." He studied her profile, the slope of her jaw, the way the moonlight touched her skin. "You don't have to decide anything yet." She nodded slowly. "You ever get tired of being alone out here?" "I did," he said, "but not lately." She glanced down at her hands, fingers knotted together in her lap. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said. "You're the reason I've been sleeping through the night." She pressed her lips together, then let out a breath that hung in the cold air. "I never thought I'd trust another man." He didn't reach for her, but he didn't move away either. "I'm not asking you to. I'm just here." She looked at him for a long moment, then stood and went inside. The next morning, she was already up, kneading dough with her sleeves rolled past her elbows. Her hair was pulled back with a strip of flannel, and her cheeks were dusted with flour. "You don't have to do that," Jonas said, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "I want to," she said, not looking up. "Feels good to make something with both hands." After breakfast, she asked him to show her how he tended the traps. She borrowed his spare boots, stuffed with rags, and wrapped her legs in canvas. They trudged through snow that reached their shins, the sunlight sharp and white against the powder. Jonas showed her how to spot faint tracks, how to reset a sprung snare, how to read the weight in the line. She listened close, asked questions that surprised him about scent masking, about thaw patterns, about how to tell if a rabbit was bred in the wild or released by hand. "You remember details," he said. "I used to read furrier ledgers for my father," she replied. He sold pelts for the rail depot back east. They moved on through the trees, their breath steaming. At a small clearing, she touched his arm. "I've been thinking," she said. If I helped, you'd get more done." He studied her face, the steadiness in her gaze. "You don't owe me your help, I know," she said. "But that doesn't mean I don't want to offer it." He didn't speak, not at first. He just reached out, took her gloved hand in his, and held it there between them. "I want you here, Selah," he said. "Not just to help." Her fingers tightened slightly around his. "Then I guess it's settled." They walked back side by side, their footprints trailing behind them in quiet pairs. The first thaw came quiet, more a softening of the wind than any real warmth. Branches dripped slow beads of meltwater, and the snowpack settled lower with each passing day. Jonas noticed the change not in the air, but in Selah, how she lingered longer outside, how her hands moved with purpose when she tied bundles of kindling or laid snares of her own. One afternoon, while Jonas was oiling the hinges on the shed door, Selah emerged from the cabin with 2 lengths of canvas stitched into rough sacks. She held them up without speaking. He nodded, setting his tools aside. "What are you thinking?" "Dried herbs, bark, maybe some spruce resin." "We've got medicine all around us if we know where to look." He studied her face, the quiet confidence there. "You said your mother kept bees. She teach you plant lore too?" "She did," Selah said, "and my grandmother before her. Folk medicine's the one thing I never forgot." They set out with her sacks slung over one shoulder and his rifle over the other, not for threats, but because mountain lions didn't care about the calendar. They moved through the woods in easy rhythm, Selah pointing out spruce tips and dried rose hips, scraping white lichen from a rock face while Jonas kept watch. Near the stream, she knelt in the snow and dug around the base of a birch. "This bark's good for fever. If you boil it down with willow slivers, it'll ease pain better than laudanum." "You planning to open up a clinic out here?" Jonas asked, half teasing. She looked up, one brow raised. "I wouldn't mind. Folks around Elk Hollow don't have a doctor closer than Casper." He crouched beside her, pushing snow from a flat stone. "You do that. Stay here, make something." "I already decided that," she said. "I just hadn't told you how far I meant to go." He leaned back on his heels. "You think people'll come all the way out here for help?" "They will," Selah said, brushing bark into her sack. "If they know someone's waiting who won't ask questions they can't answer." Jonas stood, offering her a hand. She took it without pause, their fingers closing tight. By late afternoon, they'd filled both sacks. Back at the cabin, Selah laid her findings across the table, sorting carefully. Jonas watched her move, her brow furrowed, her lips pressing together when she found a sprig of mold on a dried root. "You get quiet when you work," he said. "I have to hear what I'm doing," she answered. "Everything's got a sound when it's right." He poured water into the wash basin. "You ever think about the wedding you ran from?" She hesitated, then nodded once. "Not the man, not anymore. But I think about what made me believe I had to say yes." Jonas didn't press. He rinsed his hands and leaned against the counter. "What changed?" She looked up. "You didn't ask me to be anything but what I am. And you didn't flinch when I bled into your blankets or cried in my sleep." He swallowed. "That wasn't mercy. That was respect." Selah stepped away from the table, drying her hands on her skirt. "I don't believe in soulmates. But I believe in choosing someone over and over, even when it's hard." Jonas met her eyes. "I'd choose you every day." She crossed the floor and rested her forehead against his shoulder. "Then let's stop waiting for the thaw to decide what we already know." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her like something sacred. The fire popped behind them, and somewhere outside, the last of the snow slipped from a pine bough and landed with a soft, final thud. That night, Jonas brought out the carved box he kept beneath the floorboards, a ring made from horn and silver, shaped by his own hands, laid nestled in a square of wool. He'd made it years back, never knowing who it was for. He held it out without flourish. "I don't have words fine enough for this." Selah lifted it gently, running her thumb along the curve. "Then don't use words, just stay." "I will," he said, "for the rest of my days." She slipped the ring onto her own finger, then kissed him slow, sure, like she was sealing a promise. Outside, the wind turned and the sky cleared. Spring wasn't here yet, but it was close enough to count. The snow finally broke in the second week of March. It didn't vanish all at once, just shrank back into the shadows and hollows, clinging to the north side of trees and the low dips in the ridge. In its place came mud, thick, dark, clinging to boots and wheels alike. Jonas hitched the sled to the mare and loaded the last of the winter pelts into the crate he'd built back in January. The leather was stiff from the cold, but clean and stretched, ready for trade. Selah stood beside the sled, tying off the corners of a canvas cover. "We'll need more salt and lamp oil," she said, checking the knots, "and I want to ask after beeswax." "Beeswax?" Jonas raised a brow. She wiped her hands on the edge of her skirt. "For salves." "I've got half a jar of pine tar left, but it won't hold without something to bind it." He nodded, then climbed up onto the sled bench. "You ready?" Selah stepped up beside him, her satchel slung across her chest. "I need to speak with the Reverend." Jonas didn't answer right away. He flicked the reins and the mare started down the trail, hooves squelching through the thawed earth. The trees parted slowly, the land opening around them in wide, wet fields that would dry into green by April. They didn't speak much on the ride. The wind carried the scent of damp bark and thawed soil, and for the first time in months, birdsong threaded through the woods. Elk Hollow hadn't changed much, just a few new boards nailed to the livery roof, and smoke curling from the blacksmith's chimney. Jonas pulled the sled in behind the mercantile and tied off the mare while Selah stepped down, skirts lifted to keep them out of the muck. Inside, the shop was warm and close with the scent of kerosene and dry flour. Selah moved to the shelves without needing direction, gathering what she needed while Jonas bartered with the owner over pelt prices. They settled fair, and he left with 2 sacks of provisions over his shoulder. She met him outside, her expression unreadable. "You find the Reverend?" he asked. "I did." He waited, but she didn't say more until they reached the sled. "He's agreed to marry us Saturday," she said, voice steady. "Said he'll open the chapel even if there's no one to fill the pews." Jonas set the sacks down and turned to her. "You sure?" "I wouldn't ask if I wasn't." Her eyes held his. "I didn't come through all that snow and silence to start doubting myself now." He reached for her hand, pulling her fingers into his. "Then we'll stand together, proper-like." The ride home was slower, the mare tired, the sled heavier, but neither of them minded. Selah leaned against him, her head tucked beneath his jaw. The sky had cleared and the wind was kinder. Along one bend, they passed a cluster of blackbirds gathered on a bare branch, all facing the same direction, as if waiting for something, back at the cabin. Selah unpacked the goods while Jonas cleaned and stored the sled. She arranged the jars and bundles with care, setting aside the beeswax and a tin of alum. That night, she boiled spruce gum and melted it with the wax, stirring until it set into a soft, amber salve. She poured it into a crock and wrapped it in muslin before placing it in the small wooden chest Jonas had carved for her work. "You think folks'll come all the way out here for that?" he asked, watching her label the cloth with a bit of charcoal. "They will when they see it works," she said. "Even a farmer'll walk 5 miles if it means he can bend his knee again." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You always this sure of yourself?" "No." She looked up, her face lit by the low lamplight. "But I've learned to listen when something feels right." He crossed the room and took her hand. "Saturday, then." Saturday, she said, her voice low. They rose early that morning, dressing in quiet. Selah wore a wool skirt she'd mended the week before and a blouse she hadn't touched since Cheyenne. She wrapped her hair in a twist and tied it with a ribbon she'd kept tucked in her satchel since before the cliffs. Jonas wore his cleanest shirt, the one he'd used for trading trips and burials. He shaved, ran a comb through his hair, and cleaned his boots with a rag until they shone dull and dark. They walked the last half-mile to the chapel. The path was soft but passable, and the river beside it ran clear and fast with meltwater. The chapel stood plain and square, its windows smudged with the season, but inside the wood pews gleamed, and the air smelled of cedar and old leather. The reverend waited near the altar, spectacles perched low on his nose, book in hand. He said little, just nodded when they stepped forward and began. There were no flowers, no music, no guests. Just Selah's hand in his, her voice steady and calm as she spoke her vows, and Jonas's quiet promise in return. When the reverend pronounced them man and wife, Selah turned to him with a smile that reached the corners of her eyes. They walked back with fingers twined, the sun warm on their backs. At the cabin, Jonas lifted her over the threshold without a word, and she laughed, the sound clear and bright across the clearing. Inside, the fire burned low, and everything smelled of pine and beeswax and bread rising slow in the hearth. Selah set her ribbon on the mantel. Jonas took her hand again. They stood together in the stillness, the past behind them, the door closed against wind and hunger and old fears. What remained was quiet and whole, a life begun, a future promised. By late April the land had turned. The last of the ice had drained into the creeks, and the hills wore a patchwork of exposed earth and new grass. Jonas had begun cutting fence poles from a stand of straight young pine south of the ridge, and Selah spent her mornings planting roots and seeds behind the cabin, her hands dark with soil and her apron streaked with ash from the hearth. On the morning, the second calf dropped at the neighboring homestead a mile and a half east through thick timber. Jonas came back with a borrowed heifer and a hand-drawn agreement sealed with a shake. He unsaddled the mare, then hung his hat from the peg and found Selah kneeling beside the hearth, dropping dried elderflowers into a cloth pouch. "She came clean?" he asked, settling onto the bench nearby. "Breech," she said, folding the cloth carefully, "but the mother's strong." "It'll hold." He nodded once, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You ever think about what kind of work you'd be doing if none of this had ever happened?" She gave a small huff through her nose and sat back on her heels. "I'd probably be in a kitchen somewhere, making meals for a woman I barely knew and her 5 children. I'd be tired in a different way." Jonas looked at her hands, the calluses forming along her fingers. "You think you'd have found your way to this, no matter how things began?" "I don't know," she said, "but I know I wouldn't trade it." That evening, he brought in a cedar box he'd sanded smooth and fitted with an iron latch. It wasn't large, but it had weight, and when he set it on the table, Selah looked up from her stitching. "What's that?" "Something I've been working on between fence posts," he said, lifting the lid. Inside, folded linen, 3 small glass jars with cork stoppers and a ledger bound in stitched hide. She stepped closer, touching the edge of the cloth. "Is this for me?" He nodded. "Figured if you're going to keep treating folks, you ought to have a place for your tools. You can keep records in the back." Selah looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she reached for his face, cupping his cheek with one warm, work-worn hand. "You made me a future." Jonas didn't speak. He only leaned into her touch, then kissed the inside of her wrist. Later that week, word came from town that a wagon train had broken near the river crossing. Selah gathered her pouch and a flask of willow tonic, and Jonas rode with her, his rifle across his back and a bundle of linen packed tight against the saddle. They found a boy with a broken arm and a woman with chilblains so deep her toes had gone numb. Selah worked in the open, kneeling in the dust, her sleeves rolled to the elbow while the wind lifted her hair at the temples. Jonas boiled water for her poultices and kept the horses steady. When the sun dipped low and the worst had been tended, the family offered them half a sack of oats and a hand-sewn quilt in thanks. On the ride home, Selah leaned her head against Jonas's back. "I don't miss the quiet the way I used to." He reached back and caught her hand. "We can always make time for it." By midsummer, the garden had taken hold. Beans climbed the rough trellis beside the cabin wall, and squash spread thick across the tilled rows. Jonas had finished the fencing, and the heifer grazed lazy in the far corner of the clearing. The old cabin, once a place of survival, had become a home. One afternoon, Selah returned from the woods with a girl trailing behind her. No more than 16, with a bruise fading under one eye and a silence that pressed hard around her. Selah said the girl's name was Hattie, and that she'd walked 2 days without food. Jonas didn't ask questions. He showed Hattie where the spring ran clear behind the rocks and left a plate of bread and salt pork on the table without a word. That night, Selah sat beside the girl on the porch steps, her voice low and even. Jonas did not listen in, but when Hattie went to bed, she left her boots neatly by the door. In the days that followed, Hattie helped with the garden, quiet but constant. She didn't speak often, but she watched Selah with a kind of reverence. And Jonas saw in her something he recognized. The slow rebuilding of a person who'd once been broken. By harvest, they had enough to trade and enough to keep. Jonas built a second shelf along the back wall, and Selah lined it with labeled jars filled with dried roots and pressed leaves. Hattie learned to distinguish between red clover and yarrow, and by the first frost, she could mix a fever tonic without guidance. One evening, Selah and Jonas stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the last light bleed through the trees. "She's staying," Selah said. "She's welcome," Jonas replied. Selah turned toward him, her shawl slipping from her shoulder. "We never set out to build a family. But we built one," he said. Jonas kissed her there, with the trees at their backs and the house at their feet. It was not the first time, and it would not be the last, but it held something different now, not just promise, but proof. That winter, they added a second room to the cabin. Hattie painted the door with milk lime and ash. Selah taught Jonas to read the Latin names in her herb book, and he began carving her measuring spoons out of bone and cherry wood. They didn't speak of the past. They didn't need to. Their life was made of small things: fence posts and salves, spruce smoke and warm bread, the hush of snow falling just before dawn. And in the quiet between, there was laughter and touch, and the kind of love that asked nothing but gave everything. They grew old there, side by side, the fire always lit, the door never locked. And when the wind came down from the ridge, it passed gently over the roof, as if it too had found peace.